Good afternoon and welcome, dear parents, students, teachers, and people watching online. It is so wonderful to see you all here this afternoon and to enjoy the speeches of my grade 11 pupils. As a final part of fulfilling the Waldorf curriculum, the students undertake a project of their own choosing that both interests and inspires them. These projects range from the purely artistic to the highly academic, which promotes a deep level of understanding of humanity and each person's relationship to the world. The project comprises of 3 components: a practical, a written thesis, and a public presentation. The idea of the projects is to allow each student to have the experience of setting himself or herself a challenging goal. It also gives them a unique opportunity to initiate and direct their own inquiry process. The student remains involved in the content of the project over an extended period of time and is required to go through all that is necessary to bring it to a successful conclusion. When my students had finally settled on the topic of their projects, they were all eager to get going, but they could not have foreseen the disruption and continuous schedule changes that COVID-19 would bring about. Nevertheless, they persevered and remained determined to complete the practical aspect of their project. It has been an honor and a privilege to be their guardian for the last 3 years and to have witnessed their dedication and enthusiasm towards their work. In addition, they have all grown into fine young adults, and as they present their projects this afternoon, I marvel at the courage they have shown during these trying times. It is now my pleasure to invite our first speaker, Luke Horstman.
A person skilled in tracking can consider himself as having reached the pinnacle of bushcraft. Lieutenant Colonel Ron Reed Daly. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luke Horstman, and I chose man tracking as my grade 11 project. I chose man tracking because I feel that this is a skill that can be very useful in South Africa, but only a handful of people know about it, and even less actually know how to track. Tracking is the art of following tracks left behind by humans and/or animals. It requires the finding, observing, and making of logical conclusions from tracks and signs left by a human or animal. The bush has its own telegraph should there be an intruder. Certain wild animals and birds will react in some way or another, alerting other inhabitants of potential danger. This can either be your quarry or, more importantly, the tracker himself. Tracking demands certain qualities such as good eyesight, memory, fitness, concentration, common sense, inquisitiveness, thoroughness, patience, and most importantly, bush knowledge. Man tracking is utilized all over the world, but especially in South Africa, where it is used for tracking farm attack perpetrators. Unfortunately, since the 1700s, when it was first recorded, the art has faded and only very few people have the skill and knowledge to track. The earliest record in America of man tracking being used in combat situations goes all the way back to the early 1700s, when the British and French fought each other over the right to colonize what eventually became the 13 original states. The art of tracking was most likely passed down by native Indian tribes, who both the French and the British used as trackers. During this period, the British formed several militia-style units that were made up of American-born descendants of the original settlers who had been trained to track enemy soldiers. My first practical experience began on Monday, the 6th of January 2020. It was around mid-morning when we got in the car and drove to Kuban Lawrence's house. Upon arriving, Kuban Lawrence was a man tracker in the South African Special Task Force for 12 years and was my first external mentor for my project. Upon arriving, I packed my bags into the car, and Kuban and I started the drive to his brother's farm, which is located just outside Groblersdal in the Limpopo province. During the drive, I asked Kuban many questions about tracking, as I was new to the subject and knew almost nothing about it. We arrived at around midday. We drove for a few minutes and then stopped at a small clearing where we then exited the vehicle. Kuban told me that we were going to go for a quick walk through the bush because he wanted to collect some things. So wearing my floral shorts and Adidas sneakers, I followed him through the thorns and bushes while he broke off leaves from bushes and grasses. After about 15 minutes, we returned to the clearing where Kuban then drew a square in the ground with a stick. He then put the plants inside of it in an orderly fashion. He then began to urinate in one corner of the square. This whole time, I was just standing there trying to figure out what in the world this guy was doing. Eventually, he revealed the reason for his creation. He told me that this was an aging area and that we would return twice a day to see how the different plants aged. For the rest of the afternoon, I learned how to plot positions, establish latitudes and longitudes, and other map work. I was up at 5:30 a.m. the next day, and Kuban and I drove to a small clearing on the side of the road where I was to have my first lesson. We went through a manual with all the techniques and fundamentals needed to track someone. Earlier that morning, one of the groundsmen had walked along the dirt roads and set the spoor for us to follow. I had to try find and follow it, which at first was quite difficult as I was not accustomed to finding and following spoor. But once I realized what to look for, it became a little less difficult, but it wasn't easy. Sometimes all you could see was a stone the size of your fingernail that had been stepped on and the sand around it disturbed. The tracks were usually also on top of other animal tracks, making it hard to distinguish the track you were following. We followed the spoor for about 5 hours that day until we came to the endpoint of the track. We then rested over midday and went out again that afternoon. The following day, we started at 6:30 a.m., but this time the men laying the spoor had walked through the thicker part of the bush, making it significantly more difficult. This meant that you could only see the actual track every so often and had to rely on spotting other kinds of signs in between. It was 35 degrees that day, so I spent most of my time in the pool until around 2 o'clock when we decided to go out again. But instead of tracking, Kuban decided to show me how to make a plaster cast of a footprint. During the time that the plaster needed to dry, Kuban showed me how to make different snares to catch food should the need ever arise while in the bush. On Thursday morning, I learned how to track blood spoor. This is usually implemented when a quarry or person has been shot or injured. Tracking blood spoor is not as easy as it may sound because there are no convenient blood pools to follow, but only 1 or maybe 2 drops of blood splashed on a blade of grass or in between plants every few meters or so. After I had completed this task, we went back to the house and tried to start a manual propagation fire with a twist, the twist being gunpowder. It was sore on the hands and you had to time adding the gunpowder perfectly, but I managed to get the embers smoking. We were going to go out later that night and track using a torch. At around 6:30 p.m., I was ready to go, but just as I was about to leave, Kuban stopped me and told me to empty my pockets and take off my bag. Out of everything, he let me keep my knife and my hat. He then gave me 1 raw potato, 2 uncooked eggs, a 2-liter plastic bottle of water, 2 matches the size of your fingernail, and a 1-centimeter striking pad. I thought that this was the end of the strangeness, but then he put a bag over my head and helped me into the car. By this time, I had no words to explain what I was thinking. After driving for a while, we stopped and Kuban took the bag off my head. He then drew a circle in the ground with a 10-meter radius and told me to stand in it. He then said that I wasn't allowed out of the circle and that by the time he came back at midnight, he wanted the eggs and potatoes cooked. Then he left. I just stood there trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't remember signing up for ultimate survival. There was not much sunlight left, so I started to collect the wood in my circle for the fire. After I had everything, there were only a few minutes left of sunlight. I wasted my first match trying to light small twigs, grasses, and the label from my hat. I then remembered that I had been given the hint to use a lot of grass, so I took a handful of grass and that lit very easily. My next dilemma was finding a way to cook the food. I decided that boiling the potato and eggs in the plastic bottle was probably the best idea. So first I took 2 fork sticks and put them in the ground. I then took another stick and laid it across them. I then took the string from the handle of my knife and tied it through the bottle and around the stick. This was a slow process, but it worked. After a while, Kyudo suddenly appeared from behind a bush, which nearly sent me into cardiac arrest. Since he had come earlier than expected, I only had time to cook the eggs. Kyudo felt that I had accomplished what I had been tasked with, and we walked back to the house following his tracks with the torch. I completed my second practical in July at Swallow Safari Lodge in the Manyaleti Game Reserve. During this time, my 2 mentors were a game ranger called Alistair and an animal tracker called Wise. I only did animal tracking on this practical. I feel that this is important if one wants to become a tracker, because if you're out in the bush tracking your quarry, you have to at least have a basic understanding of the animals that you may encounter. It is important that a tracker can distinguish basic animal tracks for his own safety as well as for tracking your quarry. On Monday the 13th, I was up at 5:30 a.m. because Alistair and Wise were coming to pick me up at 6 a.m. to start our walk. When they first arrived, they asked me if I was scared of walking into predators and other wild animals, as Manyaleti is a big 5 game park. I said no, as I thought they were joking, but then they handed me an indemnity form to sign. This made me realize what I'd actually be doing. We walked along the animal tracks that day, and Wise would stop at tracks and signs of animals and explain what they were. We then headed in the direction where a leopard had killed an impala the night before and was still likely to be. After only walking for 5 minutes, Alistair spotted the impala slung over a branch in the tree, but the leopard had already finished eating and had left. We then walked down to the waterhole where we watched the animals come down to drink, as well as the hippos and the bird wildlife. We then walked back to camp, and this concluded my first day. The following day, we decided to go out in a game drive vehicle and walk back to camp afterwards. We were trying to find a new den for the wild dogs. The drive was absolutely freezing, and I felt that I'd rather be eating grasshoppers. We had only been walking for about 10 minutes when we came across a hyena who was 20 meters away from us. I remember thinking that this was the end of the line for me, but it turns out that the hyena was more afraid of us than I was of him, because he ran and hid behind a bush when he saw us. So we both just ended up standing there looking at each other through the bush. We had no luck finding the wild dogs that day, so we decided to follow some buffalo track that we had picked up on earlier. On every walk, I learned many things about the wildlife, as well as how to tell the comfort zone of an elephant, which is pretty amazing. I've really enjoyed doing every aspect of this project, especially being out in nature surrounded by animals. I still think about the time when a bag was put over my head and I was left in the bush. I haven't eaten a single egg since then. I have not come to the decision yet as whether or not I will look at a career in tracking. As I already said, the art has become unbeknown to many, so I would first need to convince the relevant people that tracking will be beneficial to law enforcement or search and rescue. But if I decide not to, I will keep doing this as a hobby, as I do not wish to forget what I've learned during my experience. I would like to thank my parents for arranging these opportunities for me, as well as for driving me to the remote places. Thank you to Ms. V for helping and assisting me. I'd like to thank my external mentors, Kyudo, Alistair, and Wise, as well as my internal mentor, Mr. Bester. I've created a slideshow with a few photos that I took during my time there. The first 2 pictures are examples of heel indentation. This is the most visible part of a print. These few photos show how difficult it can be to spot them. The next image will show an example of shine. This is what's visible when plants have been disturbed. The 4th and 5th images will show an example of blood spoor, and the final image shows a summarized version of how I made the plaster cast. The same boiling water that softens the potato hardens the egg. It's what you're made of, not the circumstances. Thank you. I would like to welcome the next speaker, Sam Jonker.
Good afternoon, parents, teachers, and classmates. My name is Sam Jonker, and I've decided to do vertical flight for my project. This entails an in-depth study of what it takes to fly a helicopter. I was first inspired to do this topic by my father, who had flown helicopters and achieved his private pilot license a number of years before. My project all began when the school asked us to present an idea. We were asked to come forward with a proposal that would spark interest and desire into our hearts. That's where I decided to choose vertical flight. I'd always been passionate about it, and I was very excited to investigate this burning fire within me. The project began, I first thought of doing vertical flight as too ambitious for the likes of the grade 11 projects. But after I'd written it through, planned it out into a proposal, and presented it, it didn't actually seem all that far-fetched. To my great pleasure and great surprise, my proposal was accepted. My internal mentor was decided shortly after that, and Mrs. Godlington didn't hesitate to help me whenever I needed it. I first began with my project by reading some old textbooks that my father had used to achieve his private pilot license. This actually ended up helping me out quite a lot later on with my theoretical. Everything was lined up perfectly, and my project was ready to commence. That was when disaster struck. As you're all very well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic had reached South Africa earlier this year, and the school, as well as the Henley Air Flight Training Center, where I had planned to do my practical experience, had closed down until further notice. This left me in quite a predicament, with no direction to follow with my practical. However, I decided to throw myself into my historical. This actually turned out to be a very difficult topic because there are, despite many different historical writings about ideas of vertical flight, the flying helicopters isn't actually a very in-depth study, with the first ever practical helicopter being flown as recently as 1939. This was the VS-300, which belonged to Igor Sikorsky, who was arguably the most important figure in the history of helicopter flight, with his two main rotor designs still being used on most modern helicopters today. However, Sikorsky cannot be held responsible for the idea of vertical flight, because that can be traced back to as early as 400 BC China, with the creation of a small wooden toy called a takatumbo, such as this one here, although it is traditionally made out of bamboo. This is the first ever use of aerofoils, which I'll explain a little later. And these aerofoils are still used in all modern helicopters today. This simple toy inspired loads of different historical writings, such as those of the Jihong in 4th century China and the Baoshi, which translates to the book of the master who embraces simplicity. These studies further inspired other pioneers, such as Mikhail Lomonosky in 1754 and Enrico Ferlani in 1878, and even inspired some of the works of the great Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance times, his most famous of which was the aerial screw. However, unfortunately, most of these designs aren't in production today. Although Sikorsky's helicopters, Sikorsky's company, the Vought Sikorsky Aircraft Division of the United Aircraft Corporation, is still in production today, creating loads of different types of helicopters. However, the Sikorsky helicopters are seen as a bit of a workhorse in the industry, with the smaller Robinson designs by Frank Robinson in 1973 being the preferred choice for most practical and economical flights today, such as the Robinson R-22, which I learned to fly in, the Robinson R-44, and the Robinson R-66. These are still in production today, which concludes the historical. I then began with my theoretical, which I'd actually started quite a lot earlier by reading my father's textbooks. These textbooks investigate a very in-depth study of the mechanical works of a helicopter. The mechanical works of a helicopter, such as aerofoils. This is the process of using curved or angled wing blades to force the air on top of the wing to move faster with the air beneath the wing. This creates an area of low pressure above the wing and an area of high pressure below the wing, thus producing lift, and that's how a helicopter flies. This, as I mentioned earlier, is still used in most helicopters with a two-rotor design, a main rotor system creating the lift and the thrust. And as long as these two forces are greater than the opposing forces of weight and drag, the helicopter will stay in the air. It also uses a smaller anti-torque rotor at the tail of the aircraft, which helps keep the aircraft straight during flight. These are just some of the basic mechanical works and physics that keep a helicopter in the air. However, there are a lot more things that go into flight before a helicopter can take off, such as safety procedures. These safety procedures include pre-flight checks, which is the process of examining every single mechanical working piece on a helicopter before flight to make sure that it's all in safe working condition to avoid any problems. It also includes radio control. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to investigate this topic too much with my project because of the complications. However, I did manage to get a few hours up in the tower at Rand Airport, where I learned about the communications between the people in the tower and the people who are flying. This helps prevent the helicopters from flying into each other and crashing. Other safety procedures include emergency procedures that are taught to the helicopter pilots before they achieve their license, so that they know what to do in case anything goes wrong. Sorry. I then began with my practical. It was June already, and the practical components of our project was due. Unfortunately, the Henley Air Flight Training School was still closed, which means I wasn't able to achieve my 40-hour flight time, which I had hoped to do for my practical. Instead, I decided to work at the airport. I did this for about 7 days with an average of 8-hour working days, which went quite well. I showed up on my first day. I was very excited, and I was wearing lots of warm layers as it was about 3 degrees outside. I rushed to catch up with the rest of the group who were having a meeting to discuss the jobs for the day. I was late, as per usual, but I did manage to get there on time. We were assigned our tasks for the day, whereas I was assigned to a person. His name was Patrick. He had been working there for a number of years, and I was going to job shadow him for the day. We started with our first job, taking out the bins. However, this anticlimactic start to the day was improved shortly after by my first promotion, mopping the hangar floors. It wasn't all that bad, though. I got to work a lot around the helicopters. I learned how to drive the souped-up golf cart that's used to move for the bigger helicopters, as well as maneuver the handheld trolley, which is used for the smaller helicopters, such as the Robinson helicopters. I also helped around with the spare parts cupboard. My job for the week was to rearrange this cupboard, this room. It was a small little room with shelves all the way up to the roof. I couldn't really fit into it straight on because the shelves were so narrow and the room was so tightly packed. The shelves were full of hundreds of different boxes of spare parts, that all had to be labeled and organized using 20-digit numbers. This took up many boring hours of my day. I also got to move around the helicopters, and mainly when I had to refuel them before their flights. This was very interesting procedure, as different helicopters have different types of fuels. You get the fuel for the turbine engine helicopters, such as the Bell 407, which is called Jet A1, and you also get the fuel for the piston-powered engines for the smaller helicopters. These pumps were managed with a tag system. Each staff member had their own tag that they would have to tag at the fuel pump in order to retract fuel. This was done to avoid theft. I also learned to rewire the inner workings of a tractor that's used for the much larger helicopters. This took me quite a while, and after a few days of very frustrating work, quite a lot of burns from electrical fires. After a few burns, I can now confidently say that I am completely incapable of changing a light bulb, and I will forever be. Sorry, I've completely lost my place. We also worked to move around the larger helicopters, such as a Bell 222, which we took to a neighboring hangar to get repainted. At the end of the week, I was quite exhausted, but I was so glad that I could manage about 38 hours of practical. I felt proud of myself and how hard I'd worked. But then I got a phone call. It was August this time, and I didn't expect this to happen. But I was told that I would be able to have my first ever flight lesson. The school had opened again, and I was arranged to go on Monday. I was absolutely ecstatic, and I couldn't wait to have my first flying experience. I ditched school that day because my lesson was at 2:00, but I managed to get there on time eventually. When I got to the airport, I was taken to a small room where I met the airport manager, Dierwald, who introduced me to my flight instructor for the day, Michelle. Michelle then took me to another small room where I had to fill in a whole bunch of paperwork for safety purposes. Michelle then led me to the helicopter, where she took me through the pre-flight checks and explained why each thing was necessary, such as checking the fuel for water droplets and making sure that all the bolts on the rotors were all still in working condition. After we had done all these checks and we had checked all around and everything was safe to go, I was ready to get into the helicopter. Just then, Michelle stopped me. She told me that I was getting into the wrong side of the helicopter. My whole life, I had always sat on the left side, but today I was going to be in the pilot's seat. This to me was the moment that I realized that I was really going to get to fulfill my dream. I got into the helicopter and we took off. I wasn't in control at this moment, but I really felt like I was flying. We headed towards a small area called Helicopter GF, which is used to train the pilots at the Henley Air Flight Training School. On the way there, Michelle told me to take control of the cyclic. This is the control in front of you, which controls the direction of the helicopter. After a bit of difficulty, I managed to get the hang of this, and I started to feel confident in myself. Michelle then told me to take control of the pedals. This was also quite difficult, but after a while, I was able to keep the anti-torque rotor straight and keep the helicopter on course. I was then told to take control of the govern, which controls the angle of pitch of the helicopter and the speed at which it climbs or goes forward. These all seemed quite simple tasks, and I felt really proud of myself for flying. After we had arrived at Helicopter GF, Michelle then told me to take control of all three. This is when it really got difficult. I only had control of the helicopter myself for about 5 minutes, but I'd never concentrated so hard in my life. After she had taken control back and I'd wiped the sweat off my brow, I realized that I'd just flown my first ever helicopter. I was ecstatic, and I did not shut up about the experience for many days after this. This then concluded my practical experience and my project with it. I am incredibly grateful for this opportunity that the school presented for me, and I can't wait to investigate this more in the future. I would like to say thank you to everyone at the airport, including my external mentor, André Kutsia, who I hope is online right now, for introducing me to this incredible world of vertical flight. I would also like to thank Mrs. Correa, our guardian, who managed to keep us all in check and ready at all occasions. I'd like to thank my classmates and my parents for supporting me throughout this process, as well as my internal mentor, Mrs. Godlington, who did not hesitate to help me with anything I needed. Thank you very much for listening. Our next speaker will be Rithik Dwarika. Sorry, bud. Thanks. I'm getting there, hang on.
Some people become cops to make the world a better place. Some people become vandals to make the world a better looking place. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, everyone in attendance at home, teachers, and my fellow classmates. This afternoon, I'll be speaking to you about my experience in the undiscovered and underrated world of street art and graffiti. At the beginning of the 2020 year, I found a new passion for street art. I began my journey into street art with one goal in mind. This was to understand the techniques, methods, and different styles that integrates itself into street art. Before I begin, I would like to familiarize you with what graffiti is. No, it is not spray painting nudity onto your cousin Sal's car. It is more about expressing how you feel, and then from there, you spray it onto a wall of various sizes for the world to see. The term street art and graffiti derive from the word graffito, which is very rarely used in the English language with the exception of archaeology, and is partially used to show an individual's dissatisfaction with society and or its politics. The first types of graffiti, street art, and doodles date back to the early 1970s. There are 8 main types of graffiti, which include tagging. Tagging is the easiest and simplest form of graffiti. It includes one color and the artist's name. Throw-up. A throw-up is a more complicated version of a tag. It usually has 2 or more colors in bubble-style lettering. Blockbuster. A blockbuster is like a massive throw-up, usually in blocky letters, and is used to cover large amounts of areas in a little bit of time. Wild style. Wild style is an elaborate version of a throw-up and is particularly hard to read. Heaven. A heaven is a type of artwork that is done in a place that is very difficult to get to. Artists who do this particular type of art generally receive a lot more respect from artists around the world. Stencil. A stencil type of graffiti is considered to be the very lazy type of graffiti, although it does get a lot of the easier details done for many artists. Poster. You just paste it up and make it at home. And finally, a sticker. Many stickers are simply tags on postage labels. While on this journey, I thought I would have been one of the greatest artists alive. This was after my first session with my external mentor. I was sadly shot down. I came to the realization that street art isn't the same as regular art. It is a whole different world and form of art and art theory, and it requires a different type of skill set to regular art. For the practical aspect of my project, I decided to approach graffiti with a very small mindset and goal. I soon learned that this was not the advisable or recommended way of going into street art. I had to think bigger and be more creative. I'll be speaking to you about a few of my favorite projects that I've done over this year, which include attempting to do a graffiti project in school. This was for our class play, The Rhino. This piece consisted of just the title and a small doodle doodle of a rhino, but in a very simplified form of graffiti, so it's easier to see from a distance. Sorry. I did this piece on the chalkboard in front of the school in a chalk pastel medium. This is considered not to be any type or form of graffiti by many artists around the world, because this usually gets erased very quickly and does not leave a lasting impression. However, I could not have done this artwork without a team of some sort. Without them, I could not have used this for my practical hours. The art and the play was a great success. My favorite piece out of everything I've done over the year was a piece that took quite some time. This is because I encountered a considerable amount of failure. This piece was a tribute art to the late legend Kobe Bryant. Not only was this piece an emotional piece to do, it was also very long and very difficult. During the course of this artwork, I had to restart multiple times because I could not get my proportions or my colors correct. This was very frustrating. After some considerable time, planning, and thought, I decided to go back and continue. I realized that it wasn't my art skill that was the problem. It was the fact that I was trying to do the very minuscule, more fine detail of the piece in spray paint, which is practically impossible to do. So I used acrylic paint to remedy this problem, and it worked very well. This is easily my favorite piece that I did, because not only was it an honor to do, but also because all of the failure that I encountered, it was all worth it in the end. In between all the bigger, more difficult pieces that I did over the year, I attempted to do some graffiti on canvas. This type of art is called street art on canvas. I required an entirely different set of equipment, which consisted of a pan that you would usually use to make your pizza on, a piece of cardboard, a knife, a sheet of scrunched up newspaper or magazine, a firelighter, and latex gloves. You can do many different types of spray paint art, but the most cliche and most used is usually planets or galaxies. These few pieces were very fun and easy to do for me. Whoa. The first of my canvas pieces was a simple black and white moon. The second, a very large pink and purple planet, and the third and final planet piece was 3 planets ranging from small to large in size. Another piece that I did is a piece that I did with my mentor, my external mentor. This piece was an image of someone wearing a skull and cloak while carrying a baby. Yes, it sounds very dodgy, but it did come out very nicely. The artwork was in a black and white with an orange color overlay. This is the piece where my mentor taught me a new skill when it comes to painting in and making the details in a piece more visible and pleasing to the eye. This method included taking a piece of cardboard and cutting or shaping it in any way necessary for you to get your said detail. This method worked so much better for me during the course of the year. Some artists use their hands to do this instead of cutting some paper and taking it with them. This was a really fun piece to do because I got to listen to music the whole day and paint with my mentor. And the piece came out absolutely gorgeous. To sum up this entire project, it was an absolutely amazing adventure. And it's safe to say that I'll continue practicing my graffiti skills for the foreseeable future. I would like to thank my mother and my brother for supporting me along this journey, the school for the opportunity to do it, and for all the street artists that I've met along the way. I would also like to thank my internal mentor, Ms. Pretorius, who, if not for her, I would not have been able to keep up with my deadlines and stay on top of my work. I'd also like to thank my external mentor, Roberto, whom without I would never have understood how to do graffiti, along with the ways of avoiding the police and not getting arrested. Thank you. Sorry. I did a slideshow for you guys to see. This is a piece that I did the background. My mentor did most of the hard work. That's the project that we did for the school play. This is the Kobe Bryant tribute art that I've done. The next two are the spray paint on canvas. And that's the creepy one. Next up, our next speaker is Julian Bester. Good afternoon, Good afternoon, teachers, parents, and fellow students. My name is Julian Bester, and today I'm going to be talking about expressive finger puppets. Since I was a small boy, I've had a love for making things with my hands, from furniture to DIY security to floating islands in my swimming pool. My whole life, I've had a great passion, constantly taking things apart to see how they work and what they're made of. A lot of these things I took apart were moving mechanisms, seeing how all the components and materials work together. The combination of mechanisms and movements really interested me, which brought me to my love for puppetry. Barnaby Dixon is a puppeteer who has given me so much inspiration and direction into my own interest to puppets. His YouTube videos demonstrates how he intricately controls puppets with his hands. His videos show how he uses unusual and unique ways to demonstrate movement, making the puppet come alive by using all the muscles and joints in his hands. This can often look characteristic and abnormal. This really inspired me and is why I chose my topic. Puppetry is ancient. Puppetry is an ancient form of artistic expression and storytelling. One example is barakanu, a traditional type of Japanese puppetry originating in the 17th century. Used in theatrical entertainment, one barakanu puppet is usually controlled by 3 puppeteers, a primary operator, and 2 assistants working together to control the limbs and facial expressions. These puppets are controlled using control rods, as the puppets are often half the size of a real person. The story is told by a single person who speaks for all the different puppets in the performance. This requires someone with a diverse vocal range, having to represent the age and gender of all the different puppets. The pace and tempo is set by music that is often performed live with the actors, slowing down or speeding up to match the pace of the story or performers. Barakanu is still being performed today, not always taking place in the traditional kabuki-style theaters, moving more and more towards Western theaters. Shows can last from a few hours to a few days, with a storyline varying in complexity and style, often being based off adaptations of scripts, such as love stories, heroic legends, or historical events. In order to make a functional and successful puppet, you need to use very specific tools, and as I learned, an organized workstation. Some of the tools I used were pliers, clippers, shears, a drill, screwdriver, bolt sander, and my most trusted friend, a Dremel. These are just to name a few. When using all these tools, seeing which one worked best, I found that my workstation became very untidy. This made it very difficult to be productive and time efficient. I ended up making a tool cart inspired by first-hand retrievability, where you don't have to move other tools out of the way in order to get another. This made it a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable to experiment with different tools and materials. One of the materials I used to make my puppet was pine, which is commonly available and affordable, but does not have a fine grain. This means that it cannot be manipulated into small and intricate pieces, causing it to unexpectedly chip, crack, or break. MDF is another type of wood that I used. It is a very soft wood made of compressed fiber. This can be easily carved and effortlessly removed with hand tools. I use sheet metal, which is a silver thin layer of metal that can be bent and formed into different shapes and sizes. This material is strong and rigid, but can be cut or ground using the appropriate metalworking tools. I also use brass, which is a golden brown metal that is light in weight but strong. Brass is soft enough to utilize woodworking tools that can be filed to remove material. Inspired by my cat's leg, I drew a simplified form and started thinking of different ways that it could be changed and modified to stand in an upright position. My first attempt resulted in a leg made of wire and dowels that allowed me to experiment with the position and shape of each limb. I learned that the wire cannot withstand a lot of weight, making me move on to another material. The next physical prototype was a wooden leg made from pine, joining each limb together using wire hinges. As I experimented with the position of each hinge in relation to each other. To try and control the leg, I used a dowel attached to my finger, moving it up and down. This movement was very inconsistent and awkward, as my fingers have limited movability and flexibility. This prototype worked well to show how the limbs worked in correlation with each other, giving me a greater understanding of what works and what doesn't. I chose to make Wood Leg 2 out of MDF, as it's easy to work with, but to my unfortunate discovery, produces a lot of dust and harmful particles that required me to constantly wear a dust mask and a lot of cleanup. Not that wearing a mask is an option anymore. To allow the legs to move further, I carved away channels that allowed it to stand taller and crouch lower. This resulted in a sturdy but easily moved leg. I then attached a control rod to prevent the leg from twisting and turning. As my first attempt in the automation of the expansion of the leg, I used an expansion spring that was mounted between the calf and the control rod. This worked better than expected, as it had a small travel distance to pull the leg upright. Windscreen leg 1 started when my mom replaced her old windscreen wiper blades, giving me the old ones. After removing the worn-out rubber, I immediately saw how I could convert the windscreen wiper into a leg. Not originally designed to move more than a few millimeters, a lot of modifications required to get a greater range of motion. To try and maintain the low profile of the leg, I used an expansion spring and a fishing wire mechanism to expand and contract the leg. It was difficult to contract the leg, and I wasn't happy with the overall performance of the first windscreen wiper leg. I built windscreen wiper leg, returning to the use of a control rod and compression springs to control the leg. Combining what I had learned previously, this allowed me to still have a slimmer, lower profile leg, but still being easy to control and maneuver. The shell and mounting frame were the next step moving forward from the legs. I started to build the mounting frame to hold the legs in place for a foundation for controlling the legs, but still keeping it in proportion to the rest of the body. To make the puppet more visually appealing, I decided to design a shell to cover the mounting frame. As a prototype and proof of concept, I modified an old deodorant bottle, redistributing material and mass to create the body. Not truly realizing the size and complexity of my project, I've been left with a puppet that is nothing like what I've ever seen before or could have ever imagined making. I got to where I did through constant trial and error, taking failure and turning it into features and functionality. This project has not only tested my determination and ability to create, but also how to go forward from failure. Being faced with problem after problem,
learning how to regulate your reactions and expectations to the process of development. Looking at where my project started to where it is now, I'm proud to see the growth and development of ideas, concepts, and dreams, all working together to form part of a project that I will continue to work on. I would like to say a very special thank you to Mr. Mbaye and Ms. Godlington as my internal mentors, as well as my family, for all the work, time, and effort they have put into helping me develop and grow my project to where it stands today. I would not have been able to do what I have done alone. Thank you. Next speaking will be Christopher Lyon.
Hard to breathe with the mask. Okay. Hello, everyone. Be it teachers, students, classmates, or online attendees. My name is Christopher Leong, and for my grade 11 project, I decided to do Kyudo, or traditional Japanese archery. Now, the main question that I get asked is, what's the difference between Western archery and traditional Japanese archery? And to that, I say, if you want to compare the two, you can't compare them. They are two different sports. For example, we use a different bow in Kyudo, and we also have a gi. Now, I would be wearing the gi today if my teacher would allow me to go a third of the way naked on stage. I don't think anyone wants to see that. So traditionally, in Western archery, your typical bow, be it compound or traditional, starts roughly at your shin and ends at your shoulder. Whereas in Kyudo, we have a long bow, which starts at your toes and ends above your head. This is for max power and distance. So there's also differences in stance. For example, when you're firing in Western archery, you stand sideways with your one foot facing your target. In Kyudo, you have both your feet facing the same direction with your toes pointing towards the target. So let me speak to you about my historical. So Kyudo being a type of archery, it predates history. There is no specific date that I can say Kyudo started. However, I can say that it was used as a main method of warfare until, unfortunately, British colonizers decided to bring muskets to Japan. This was very tragic, as many samurai lost their lives to muskets while they were still using bows. So a prominent clan in Kyudo history is the Minamoto clan. Now, one of the founders of the Minamoto clan was one of the greatest archers of all time. He stood hundreds of meters above sea level with his troop of archers, and he was scanning for enemy clans. He noticed that one of them were sailing past with a small decorative fan atop their ship. This was used as a threat, or at least that's how Minamoto saw it. And his response was to pull out an arrow and fire. This boat was thousands of meters away. There was no possible way any person now would be able to hit that target, especially with Western bows. So, after the battle was over, archaeologists discovered the fan, and there was a small hole, and they determined that it had to have been Minamoto's arrow, which itself is incredibly impressive. And the issue with this is that his bow was specially made because his right hand was a few inches longer than his left, which is very strange, but it allowed for him to fire much more powerful arrows than anyone else in the world. So I say this because the bow was made very special, and it proved very difficult for me to make a bow, as only the most experienced and powerful artisans could make bows. And if you look at me, I have noodle arms. So let me explain to you my practical. It was a very ambitious task because, once again, I have very small arms and I'm very weak. But, of course, I still took it on because I like to challenge myself. The first thing I needed was bamboo. That's what most bows are made out of. So my father took me to go buy some bamboo. Most bamboo used for Kyudo yumi, which is bow, have to have its bamboo treated for 3 years in damp weather and then another 3 years in a warehouse. This was a 9-month project. I did not have time. So we bought some dead bamboo, which was very, very bad. So before I continue on my experience in building my bow, let me tell you about my experience firing an arrow. I visited a dojo, and I stood there as my instructor showed me how to properly fire an arrow. So apparently you're supposed to split your legs very far apart. If you think your legs are far enough apart, you're wrong. Move it more. So I stood in the stance and I fired. The arrow went into the gutter, and if I picked it up, I would be disqualified in a tournament. So I picked up my arrow after he said I could, and then he said, try fire another arrow. So I stood in the stance. I took my bow and I pulled the string back. I looked forward and let go of the string. It hit the back of my ear, and I didn't realize what happened, but apparently I hit the target. My instructor looked at my father and said, should I tell him that doesn't normally happen? And I looked at the other people who were firing, and not many of them hit the target. I obviously tried to play it cool because I didn't want them to know I actually hit myself. So I got home and started thinking about how in the world am I going to cut this bamboo for my bow, sorry. And my father comes home the next day with a machete. You know, Indiana Jones. So I tried splitting the bamboo, and that gave me multiple calluses on my hand, but I finally got the bamboo cut. Then I realized that I needed to flatten the bamboo. This would prove a very difficult issue because I didn't have a heat gun, and I needed to heat the bamboo to make it malleable. I switched to the next best thing, my mother's hairdryer. So this would not work very well. And that same weekend, my brother came home, took the hairdryer, and left. So I was out of options. So I decided to try and heat it in water and squish it between other bamboo to make my project go a bit faster. So I went to school the next day, and I went to my mentor and told him I have an issue. And he gave me the best advice I could possibly give anyone, which is people who want to do the work will make a plan, whereas people who don't will make an excuse. So I decided to make a plan. I looked around the school thinking of ways to do it, and I noticed there was a large roller for flattening concrete. And that was the idea I had. Unfortunately, lockdown happened and I wasn't able to use the roller. So I thought, this is not the issue I should focus on right now. Let me think about other things. I needed to make a core, I needed to attach the bow together, and I needed supports for the string. I also needed a string. So I realized I don't have proper measurements for making a support. I don't know what I'm doing, and parachute string is a bit expensive. And I realized I needed a certain sap called Nguyen, which can only be obtained in Japan. So unfortunately, I was not able to finish my bow. I started researching other glue-like substances. Super glue would snap if I tried using it, and heat glue would just melt when I tried and bended it. So unfortunately, that's where my project had to stop. There was not much I could do, but I can say that this project has taught me a lot. For example, it's taught me about determination and dedication. Determination and dedication is like cheesecake. I'm lactose intolerant, so if I have those, it's very scary for everyone. So before I end off, I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank my father for buying me tools and driving me places. I'd like to thank my mentor, Mr. Mbaye, for giving me really good advice. And I'd like to thank my mother for giving me some common sense when I don't have it. And finally, I'd want to thank my legs for always supporting me, my arms for always being at my side, and my shoes for lifting me up. The next speaker you will hear is Aaron McCofton. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, teachers, parents, and fellow classmates. My name is Aaron Michaela Metcalf-Dunn, and for my project, I chose specialized kinesiology. Kinesiology is the science of energy balancing and is grounded in the study of anatomy and physiology. It is a non-invasive technique of using muscles as monitors, usually referred to as muscle testing. Muscle testing can identify the underlying reasons for a person's discomfort, whether it may be mental, emotional, chemical, or physical. Kinesiology aims to detect and correct imbalances that relate to stress, nutrition, or minor injuries. It can be useful in many ways and help one release emotions that usually go unnoticed, but cause problems as a means of being acknowledged by festering under the surface. Specialized kinesiology does not attempt to diagnose a condition nor treat named diseases, as specialized kinesiologists are not medical professionals, but rather work with the body's innate ability to heal itself. Kinesiology incorporates many techniques from other alternative medical practices, such as acupuncture, chiropractic, osteopathy, and homeopathy. These practices are, however, considered by some as mumbo-jumbo, though have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In this project, I aimed, or at least to see for myself, whether kinesiology is a proper form of treatment and therapy, or if it has placebo effects. Dr. George Joseph Goodhart was an American chiropractor who developed applied kinesiology. He used his knowledge of chiropractic to create this new technique of muscle testing. With his newly found technique, he was able to make the muscle stronger and even out the imbalances that once occurred. Dr. Goodhart laid the foundation for applied kinesiology. It's important that I say now that applied is not the same as specialized. Applied kinesiology is a practice used within integrative medicine and is used by those licensed to perform those procedures. Applied kinesiologists may be chiropractors, neuropaths, doctors, and nurses, as well as other healthcare workers. Dr. John Francis Thie was an American chiropractor who based much of his work off of Dr. Goodhart's. He is the creator for Touch for Health, an at-home healing manual. Kinesiology uses methods from it in basic practice. Dr. Bruce Dew and Joan Dew from New Zealand founded the International College of Professional Kinesiology Practice in 1998. ICPKP is a worldwide school that teaches kinesiology. The syllabus is taught in institutes and colleges in 13 countries from around the world. It was at one of these colleges that I spent my year learning specialized kinesiology. The theory behind kinesiology stems from often observed human characteristics, like how the body holds emotions, stresses, and traumatic experiences, as well as how the muscles and organs interconnect. Due to it being able to look at the bigger picture, it can eradicate issues from deep within the subconscious to put those feelings at bay in a holistic approach. Unlike modern medicine, which would rather treat the condition on surface level with a quick fix, rather than truly solve the underlying problem. In this instance, kinesiology is a much safer approach to healthcare. I'm not saying in any way that modern medicine does not have its place and well-respected uses, but it can also be a dangerous suppressant which is used more often than required. An example would be if somebody is depressed, and instead of digging a little deeper to discover the trauma at fault, they simply suppress those emotions by taking an antidepressant, which relieves the symptoms but not the problem. Kinesiology uses forms of psychology to understand and then link emotions and traumas to a physical release. I myself have experienced how experiences can be held within one's body. One morning, I woke up in immense pain. My neck and shoulder were so sore that I was unable to move my head to the right. Due to my newly learned skills, I decided to muscle test what was going on. I discovered that my neck pain was a result of the negative emotions I'd felt the night before. As I recapped the previous day, I realized that this was true. Due to me going to bed angered by the events of the day, I was holding tension in my physical body. After making this and identifying the emotion I had, the pain decreased by almost 50%. After making this discovery, I decided to release the emotion by rubbing and rolling the cartilage on my ears, which are the correction points for neck tension, and the pain was almost entirely gone. I could have made my life simple though. I could have just taken an anti-inflammatory, and the pain would have disappeared, but that would have not solved my problem because the pain I felt was not physical, it was emotional. The emotion needed to be released, and that's why it caused me physical pain, to confront what was happening psychologically. This was just my experience, but as I continued throughout the year, I was able to see how it can have effects on the body and how kinesiology is used. During my time in class, I was not only able to practice what I had learned on others, but also see for myself the effects it had, which then consolidated the theory. In kinesiology, we are taught that specific muscles, acupressure points, and other techniques relate to specific organs. This theory was proved when a classmate's muscle in relation to their kidneys unlocked. What this means is the psoas, which is the organ interface for the kidneys, was unable to resist the force I exerted on it multiple times throughout the year. However, we only realized recently that it was due to them being born with a defect in their kidneys that caused this unlock. The defect is responsible for the unlock. In this case, I was able to see how the theory spoken about was correct, because the unlock showed me that the muscle was displaying a problem for the kidneys. This proves that it could not have been a placebo, because if in the first instance they knew they had a problem with the kidneys, we would have not witnessed the way that their body was indicating to us the problem area. These cases show how powerful and helpful kinesiology is, and how it can be used in daily life, and it definitely shows that it should not be considered as mumbo-jumbo. I would like you all to experience the technique used, but first a bit of background. We are going to do a fear diffusion using frontal occipital holding. To do this process, we need to understand what is happening in the body. For this, we need to understand a little bit about the nervous system. If you think of the brain as the central computer that controls the functions of your body, then the nervous system is the network that relays messages back and forth from the brain to different parts of the body. In life, we are controlled by two primary motivating factors. One is to survive and one is to reproduce. Both are controlled by the nervous system. How we survive is determined by how able we are to adapt. By its very nature, survival is a reptilian or back brain function. We are programmed to survive at all costs, even if it means functioning in an inefficient way. In today's world, living under the stressful conditions that we do, it's easy to go into survival mode. Under stress, our forebrain functions minimally, and the extra blood, oxygen, and nutrients goes to the survival or reptilian area of the brain, as well as the large muscles for a flight or fight response. With our ability to think out to lunch, we cannot easily adapt to situations and circumstances. We don't live life to the fullest. Rather, we defend against further stresses and paint ourselves into a safe corner with our defense walls intact. Stress hormones become dominant. Certain parts of the brain become dominant, and certain behaviors become dominant. And we respond to life out of a limited and limiting repertoire. What this means is that we cannot find new options or think clearly in a stressful situation. So we work from a memory-based neurology and we react. React means that we don't make decisions. Rather, we act again in the same way we did last time and the time before that, because we survived it then. The problem, of course, with this memory-based system is that we are reacting to a situation in the same way as when we were perhaps 3 years old, and the first time we experienced a similar stressful situation. Dr. Terence Bennett, in the early 1930s, using a full-body fluoridoscope, showed that touch redirects blood supply. This means that when we hold the front of our head, we are bringing back blood from the body to our forebrain. The forebrain is where we think logically and creatively and come up with new solutions to any problem. The hand on our occiput allows us to visualize because that's where the visual centers of our brain are. Another important piece of information to know is that the brain does not differentiate between fact or fiction. A recall of a stress or a fear can bring back the same chemical response as if it were happening right now. Frontal occipital holding allows us to stop the stress reaction, bring blood back to the four areas of the brain, and allow us to imagine new and different options to a situation. We are not changing what happened. We are, however, taking the stress off of an event and thinking about it without the stress hormones being activated. This allows us to find new solutions to any problem. So I invite you now to think of something stressful or embarrassing in your life. It could be a new or an old issue. Get a sense of how stressful it is on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being extremely stressful. Now, put one hand on your forehead and one hand on your occiput and close your eyes. I encourage the people at home to do the same. If you feel tired, you may rest your elbows on your lap. I would like you to imagine your very own movie theater. Notice what it looks like. It can be big, it can be small. Does it have a color? Does it have a smell? Go into your movie theater and sit in the middle. Notice what you're sitting on. It could be a bed, a hammock, or anything else. Now notice that there's a movie projector next to you. Turn it on and run the movie of the stressful or embarrassing incident on the movie screen. Run it from the beginning to the end. Now run it backward from the end to the beginning. This time, run it from the beginning to the end and make it black and white. You can also make the picture smaller or turn the sound down. I invite you now to take the movie roll out of the projector and find a way to destroy it so that it can't come back. You can cut it up, burn it, bury it, whatever works for you. As you are the director of this movie, you can now rewrite scenes and new endings. Play the new video and the new story. You can change what happened or how it happened or what was said. If you feel as though you can't change anything, you can try and change how you feel about it. When you have it exactly the way you want it to be, put yourself into the movie and run it again. Notice now what happened. Hear what was said that is different, and notice how you feel about it. Play it one more time from the beginning to the end, just the way you want it to be remembered. You may now open your eyes. You can now reassess the stress level about the incident on a scale of 1 to 10. Is it less than when you started? My experience of kinesiology was an overall positive one. This opportunity showed me something unique. Whilst it had its challenges, amplified by lockdown, I wouldn't change my experience because what I learned about myself and my abilities were the true takeaways of this experience. I would like to take this moment to say a few thank yous. I would like to thank my internal mentor, Mrs. Thurlow, for helping me with my book as well as marking my project sections, my parents for driving me to class late on Friday nights and early on Saturday mornings, and my external mentor, Margie Dondi, for teaching me all that I know about kinesiology, for helping me edit my written components, and for taking the time to make sure that we as a class did not miss out on anything because of lockdown. Finally, I would like to say thank you to the school for allowing us to go out and learn new skills that we otherwise would have never thought to go out and learn. Thank you. I would now like to welcome Julian Holtz.
Good evening, parents, teachers, and mentors. I am Julian Holtz, and for my project, I completed my basic paraglider's license. Fill your life with experiences, not things. Have stories to tell, not things to show. By Ray David. I had no specific reason why I wanted to do paragliding. It is just one of the amazing things I've always wanted to do. I knew it would be challenging, scary, and would take me out of my comfort zone. Paragliding is seen as a dangerous extremist sport, but is comparable in death rate to diving. However, paragliding is as dangerous as you make it. The history of paragliding started all the way back with Leonardo da Vinci's first design of the parachute. This parachute was proven very successful when built to scale many years later. This parachute is the beginning of modern-day parachutes. The first human flight was executed by the Wright brothers. They invented, built, and flew the first parachute, the first aircraft, the first controlled, heavier-than-air, powered aircraft flight. Through soldiers and aeronautical engineers testing and redrawing the parachute, the paraglider started taking shape. It started off as a slow parachute, and over the years was made into a very inefficient paraglider. When paragliding first took off, the pilots needed a small periscope tool that they would look through in order to see if they would make the glide down to the bottom of the hill without hitting any trees or hillside. To this day, the paraglider is becoming more efficient every year. The paraglider itself is effectively designed to stay up in the sky for as long as possible, with the least energy used. The world record solo flight lasted 56 hours without touching the ground and was executed in 1956. The world record two-man flight lasted over 70 hours and was executed in 1961. A large factor when paragliding is altitude sickness. This can get dangerous when the pilot is unable to count, passes out at heights of over 2.5 kilometers. The paraglider is made up of strong suspension lines, materials, and a harness. Controlling the glider requires the pilot to understand the equipment as well as how the paraglider flies in the sky. Despite the simple-looking left and right brake toggles, there are other variations of the sport, like winch paragliding and powered paragliding. Winch paragliding is where you are towed by a winch or other vehicle, and powered paragliding is where you have a motor with a big propeller on your back that propels you fast enough to gain altitude without needing a natural source of wind lift. When paragliding legally, you need at least a basic paraglider's license. This license can then be upgraded to a sports license, instructor's license, or tandem license. I acquired my basic paraglider's license in about 2 weeks of almost constant training. On the first day, my dad and I arrived in Bulver at the paragliding school in the late evening. We were introduced to the instructors, Hans and Ria. We did some paperwork and some theory on how the controls work, where to find the best lift, and how to pack and unpack the glider. The next day, I was pleasantly surprised when we headed out to the small slope for my first flight. I started off just running down the hill, learning how the glider turns and when to flare for the landing. I was very motivated to get my feet off the ground when a meter-long snake jumped out of the grass in front of my feet, thinking I was out to get it. This happened twice. On the second day of flying, I was a little disappointed because after slightly higher flight, I ended up landing in a field of brambles, which took about 20 minutes collecting the strings out of the thorns, and another 20 minutes collecting the thorns out of my legs. A few days into the training, I was driven up to the top of the Bulver Mountain. The takeoff is about 300 meters above the landing field. At first, this was a great shock to me. The wind was not very strong, so I glided down to the bottom quite easily, but very uncomfortably. I was instructed and directed through a radio on my harness, a radio on Hans's harness at the top of the mountain, and a radio with Ria in the landing field. The more flights I did, the more confident I became, and it started feeling a bit more natural. My first actual flight that consisted of more than just gliding lasted about 21 minutes. I was circling around and around in a thermal bubble, getting enough lift to reach the height of takeoff again. It felt so amazing, unlike anything I'd ever felt or even imagined. On days when the wind was unusable, we did ground handling. This is when you stand on the ground and keep the wing overhead without taking off. This practice is to learn more about your glider and how to place it without damaging it. At that stage, I had about one hour of airtime out of the required 4 for the basic license. It was taking longer than we were expecting. Something about the appearance of all the local pilots meant that there was a good wind on its way. The day started off early with a constant easterly wind, which was perfect for the flying site. This meant that I would be flying with other pilots for the first time. It was very intimidating because I was in the sky with 7 other pilots. This was a very successful day because I completed a total of 3 hours of airtime in 13 flights. My last flight lasted about 45 minutes, and I landed only because I was too cold to carry on, and it was getting dark. I had made the mistake of leaving my gloves behind. Apparently the day had not been exciting enough, and we only ended up going to bed at 3 a.m. because we had to go help out with a felt fire by making fire breaks and backbones. After completing the basics exam and finishing up some paperwork, I had a few more flights before driving back home. I had 2 very scary wing collapses during the training, but recovered them well before danger. To conclude, what I learned is that my view on paragliding is very different to what it was before, and that if you don't have patience, you won't survive very long. I would love to continue this adventure in the near future. I have a total of 4 hours and 42 minutes of airtime in 37 flights. Lastly, I would like to thank my parents for assisting me through this project, Mr. Art for helping me with the written component, Mrs. V for helping me perfect my speech and my slideshow, Hans and Ria for teaching me to fly, and the school for allowing me this amazing opportunity. A quote by Anonymous: "Life is about moments. Don't wait for them, create them." Here is a slideshow I thought you might enjoy. Next up is Leletu Mda.
I was walking back from the shop alone, fully clothed, because that's what I was taught to do. But yet he was still there. He whistled. He followed me.
He asked me for my number. He knew that I was uncomfortable, that I didn't want to speak to him, but he still carried on coming closer to me. He asked me where I live, and I said nowhere. He asked me where I was going, and I said nowhere. I tried to walk faster so that he could leave me alone. And he asked me, "Why are you walking so fast?" "I just want to get to know you because you're so beautiful." So what then? Did he expect me to be flattered? I wasn't. As I tried to walk faster and faster, he walked just as fast. And if I had not reached the boom gate in time, I don't know what would have happened. I was lucky, but this is not the first time that this has happened to me or any woman in South Africa. Femicide in South Africa is 5 times higher than the global average, meaning that women are 5 times more likely to be killed by men. Every woman, no, every girl and woman experiences some form of harassment. So why am I saying this? Because I don't want to be another statistic. I don't want to feel scared or reliant on a man to protect me. I just want to have a little protection. I want to be able to fight back. I want to feel powerful, like Cara Gracie, Rose Namajunas, and Ronda Rousey. What all these powerful women have in common is that they wouldn't be where they are without MMA or Jiu-Jitsu. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lele Tunda, and I chose to do self-defense for my project. Jiu-Jitsu first came to be in Japan when it was used as a last resort for combat, but its armor was too heavy for its mobility. Gradually, it dispersed and transitioned into a self-defense rather than a combative fight. Mitsu Meda, who was a top student at the Kodokan, a judo school in Japan, traveled to Brazil and met Gustavo Gracie in 1914. Gustavo wanted him to teach his son Carlos his Newaza-style-based judo, and Carlos later taught his brothers. However, one specific brother, Helio, who had a small build compared to his brothers, found it hard to follow his brother's techniques. This inspired him to adjust the techniques to suit his capabilities and everyone else's. This led to the creation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Throughout the years, BJJ evolved, and in 1933, to prove that this martial art is efficient, a tournament in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, also known as the UFC, was created. Royce Gracie, who also has a small build, just like his father Helio, defeated every single opponent in that tournament and proved that with the right technique and leverage, the smallest man could defeat the biggest man in the room. MMA was also introduced as a combat sport in 1983, when martial artists realized that they did not have to use one specific martial art. As we all know, throughout history, women were not allowed to partake in manly activities, and combat was one of those activities. Women were only allowed to pursue jiu-jitsu as a fighting career in 1985, thanks to Yvonne Duarte. She, with her brother, convinced the Rio de Janeiro Federation to open a women's division, and in 1980, she was the first woman to open up her own Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academy. Cara Gracie, who comes from a long lineage of BJJ fighters, worked hard to prove her worth to her family and society. She is a 5-time world champion, 3-time ADCC champion, and 3-time Pan American champion. In 2009, she explored other martial arts and came back in 2011 and trained at the top BJJ academies in the world. So, what is Jiu-Jitsu? I always thought it was some useless ground fighting that would not be able to assist me at all in self-defense. It just looked so easy to me. However, through this project, I learned that it is a type of martial arts that uses its opponent's weight against them. The most common moves or positions that you may have seen in BJJ are side control, full mount, back mount, guard, and submissions, such as chokes, joint locks, and compression locks. Many famous female fighters, such as Ronda Rousey, who was the first to bring a name to the women's UFC, used these moves, especially the armbar submission, which was her signature winning move. Rose Namajunas, in a fight against Joanna and Jessica, used full mount and armbars to try and gain control over the fight. When I first began this project, I had no clue as to what I was doing. When Ms. Korea told me to pick a martial art that fits into self-defense, I was so confused because I thought that self-defense was its own martial art. I found out that I was very wrong. I first started with Aiki Sambo. And if you do ask me right now what is Aiki Sambo, I will not be able to tell you because I still don't even know myself. All I know is how to defend myself at knife or gunpoint, a move called kotekashi ich, which I shall demonstrate later, and how to count up to 10 in Japanese. Ich, ni, san, chi, go, ruk, sich, hach, ku, chu. And unfortunately, that was all I had learned before COVID-19 took place. I came back to training in July with only 10 hours having been done and having ventured into a new martial art. Welcome to my very short boxing journey, which I turned into by complete accident. I was looking up martial arts studios close to me and stumbled upon Gracie Bar in Sunny Hill. I emailed them on the 17th of July and they told me that they had not opened yet. Then on the same day, I received a very random call from someone that I do not know. And I am very skeptical when I receive calls from people I don't know. So I watched my phone ring and even danced to the ringtone until it came to voicemail. Then the same number sent me a message saying that he is from Gracie Bar and someone that I did not even know suggested him to me. It did hit my mind that I should email the studio to see if this checks out just to make sure he wasn't a dodgy guy. But me, being the person that I am, decided that I was going to take a leap of faith and see where this takes me. So I was very excited because this meant I was going to finally finish my practical. When I went there on Tuesday, he looked and seemed like a pretty trustworthy guy, and there were also other people there, so I thought that this could work out. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I said self-defense because I still did not know what type of martial arts fit into self-defense. He said that he was going to start me off with the basics of boxing and later on groundworking and kicking. I was a bit skeptical, but then I thought to myself, Leletu, he is a professional. So, and you are the amateur. So just let it be, go with the flow. Now, here comes the reason as to why I should have emailed the studio in the first place. I received an email from them on the 24th of July saying that they were going to open on the 1st of August and asked if I still wanted to join. I was very confused because I thought they knew that I was training with one of their employees, or how and why else would he have contacted me in the first place? It was only on my last day that I found out that he actually rents at the studio and he does not work for the studio, which now made a lot of sense. So my 4 days of training there consisted of me practicing footwork, punches, kicks, and combinations of boxing. The lesson that I learned from this was that I should trust my instincts and clarify on my doubts. Because I did not want a boxing trainer, I wanted self-defense. But because I did not know what that was at the time, I thought it was helping me. However, I do not regret doing boxing. It was a lot of fun. I could have started a career, who knows? However, my boxing detour ended and August came. I still needed 26 more hours of my practical to be completed. Luckily, my amazing and helpful internal mentor, Mr. Haas, suggested an amazing place at Fourways called Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Why I never thought of going there in the first place baffles my mind, but I believe that I needed this journey to learn what worked for me and what didn't. And it was jiu-jitsu. How ironic. What I really liked about this place is that they clarified on my doubts before I even had the time to think of them. When I started getting into the moves and positions, my theoretical started to make a whole lot more sense because when I was writing my theoretical, I was just writing what Google told me to write. I thought I was writing complete nonsense. I learned how to get into a full mount from a clinch, side mount, back mounts, guard, and some submissions. If you are anything like me, you must be wondering, what are these moves and positions that this child has been rambling on about? Do not worry, I will demonstrate a few later. This project for me was a very difficult one to do, especially after the lockdown took place. But I wasn't even sure if I was going to finish my practical. But I needed to do this, not because I wanted to finish my project, but because of the first reason I had decided to do this, to be able to defend myself. I'm not naive to believe that this is going to protect me from the whole world, but I do believe that it will at least make me feel like I don't have to be reliant on other people to fight my battles for me. I chose self-defense because I did not want to worry about having to look over my shoulder all the time, or worry about asking a man to go with me wherever I go, or worry if what I was wearing is asking for it. I chose self-defense because I wanted to feel like the powerful woman that I am, so that I may never feel the fear that I used to feel when walking alone. I chose it just to have a little protection. I would like to thank my parents for paying trusting, and supporting me through this unknown journey of martial arts. I would like to thank my siblings for letting me practice on them. I would like to thank my external mentors, especially Mike and Jason from Gracie Jiu-Jitsu Fourways, for giving me a new perspective on Jiu-Jitsu and clarifying on my doubts. I would like to thank the school for giving me this opportunity to learn my potential through this project. I would like to thank Ms. Korea for pushing us to persevere through this painful and trying process. And lastly, I would like to thank Mr. Hoff for guiding me in my journey and sending me videos to try and lock down, because I did not even know where I was going to start. Thank you all for listening to my speech. I will now demonstrate a few things I have learned, and after that is Mikhail van den Berg. Thank you. I will not step on this.
For a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories. Plato. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mikhail van den Berg, and I did my grade 11 project on black slope skiing. Like most other ancient philosophers, Plato maintained a virtue-based, humanistic conception of ethics, meaning that his moral value was based on the likelihood of actions producing happiness. That is to say, happiness is the highest aim of moral conduct, highest aim of moral thought and conduct. He believed to strive for distinction would be part of achieving said happiness, that would bring forth our true character, developing our strengths, unlocking our wisdom, and tuning in to our innate greatness. The Grade 11 project has always encapsulated this rather well for me. It's supposed to teach us how to set a goal of a certain magnitude and achieve it throughout all its hardships. Nothing had fitted this criteria for me until one day an opportunity arose, an opportunity to really challenge myself. Skiing came to mind when a possibility for me to go to the French Alps came up, and I was beyond excited for that idea, and skiing quickly became my first choice. I was ready for this experience and even more ready to conquer this skill. 22,000 years ago, back when the first early modern human decided to attach 2 sticks to his feet and jump off a snowy mountain, it was not for the fun of it, but rather out of the means for survival. The Scandinavians, or anyone else who had to live with an immense amount of snow, developed some form of skiing or another. The recent discovery of cave paintings depicting these early humans hunting on skis dates the invention of skiing back to at least the last ice age. Skis were in regular use by Scandinavian farmers, hunters, and warriors throughout history as they traveled across the steep European snow-covered mountains. The history of skiing is closely intertwined with many major bloody conflicts, as it was a major use for Scandinavian militaries from the 15th to the 17th centuries. During the 1760s, the Norwegian army began to hold skiing competitions for their men. These competitions consisted of competitors coming down a hill whilst weaving through obstacles, while simultaneously shooting at targets. These races became inherently popular and were the precursors for the original Winter Olympic Games that we're so familiar with today. 150 years later, men and women's alpine skiing debuts on the Olympic program in 1936 Berlin. Before this, skiing was not seen near or even thought of as an Olympic event. Although there was only one ski event that year, although there was only one ski event that year, the inclusion of it signaled for the unprecedented rise in popularity for the sport that would take place over the rest of the century. Usually, the length of a pair of alpine skis is relatively close to the height of the skier themselves. Alpine skis are around 3 inches wide. While cross-country skis are somewhat shorter and narrower. Freestyle skis are much shorter than alpine skis, as they need to be small and maneuverable to be able to perform any tricks. All types of skis are pointed and turned up, usually slightly wide at the tip and shoveled and squared at the tail. They are thickest at the waist under the foot and thinnest at the ends. Alpine skis have sharp steel edges at the bottom that bite into hard snow or ice. Jumping skis are about 2.6 meters long and thicker and wider than any other type of downhill skis. I had 7 days to complete my practical, and in those 7 days, I had set it out to complete a black slope. Ski slopes are color-coded, black being recommended for very advanced or expert skiers. It may not have seemed like the most achievable goal at the time, but I knew it would mean I would really have to push myself if I had any hope in completing this project in the limited time that I had. It all started with that unmistakable crunch of snow under my foot as I took my first steps onto the slope. I'd been planning it for months now, and now that it finally arrived, I was feeling the rush. I can vividly recall the sight when I took my first gondola lift up to the top of the mountain. As I slowly creeped to the top, I got to experience the immense beauty of the surrounding valleys. There were just snow-covered mountain peaks as glistening in the sun as far as the eye could see, and that image has been burned into my mind ever since. That first day went exactly how one would have expected. Started off slow as I began to get my bearings. With my limited prior experience, at least gave me a bit of an edge to get some of my basic skills in order. As my first day drew to an end, I was feeling rather confident in my own abilities. My biggest takeaway for basics was to always commit to my movements, no matter what, and to just be confident in yourself and your own abilities. Leaning back because you're nervous throws your whole balance off on the slope. If you strike a confident stance and lean slightly forward, you'll be much better off. I remember when I first discovered moguls. I was completely blindsided and I did not know the difficulties that would occur with them. Moguls are large bumps formed when skiers push snow into mounds. Although most slopes get cleared regularly, moguls form rather quickly, and before midday, a ski slope is usually covered in them. The difficulty with moguls lies in navigating them, as they greatly constrict your turning ability and make it near impossible to control your speed. It takes time and skill to do mogul skiing, and I had neither. As a South African, I can't say that I had much experience with any blizzards. My first encounter with one was rather eventful. The blizzard began to roll in, and as I usually do, I made the smart decision and I ignored my instructor's warnings. So we pushed to do one more slope. We jumped off the ski lift and began our descent when I quickly realized that I could see nothing but a vast white void of emptiness. That was my first encounter with what is called a whiteout. And as one would do when they think they are going to die, I began to freak out. When I finally had accepted my fate, I caught a glimpse of another skier waving his poles in the distance. Probably realized how lost I was and signaled me to follow, which I did. I followed him down to the foot of the mountain, and as I was standing there, I was amazed that I made it out there alive. And I had the realization that I may not always be right, and that I also, maybe a South African knows a little less about a blizzard than anyone who may have experienced one. I knew that the weather was unpredictable, and I had no idea when we would have another day of clear skiing. So I made the executive decision and decided there was as good a time as any to do my first black slope, Cascades. It was the perfect black slope. It may have been off-puttingly steep and covered in moguls, but despite all that, it was at least short. The moment had finally arrived. I was standing on the edge of the slope, my heart racing, but I was not scared, but rather exhilarated. I went down the slope as confidently as any other, and a blast of adrenaline surged through my body after that initial drop. I could feel my body weight shifting, cutting through the snow in a rhythm. I was doing it. I was halfway down the slope, and I was doing it rather well. Before I knew it, I made it to the bottom, and my legs collapsed right underneath me, and I fell to the ground. I couldn't believe that I actually did it. And as I lay there in the snow, I felt rather proud of what I just accomplished. I set out a goal, and I achieved it throughout all these hardships and difficulties that came along the way. Even the best of us fall down sometimes. Do not let a temporary setback make you stop trying. There's nothing more gratifying than making it down a slope, a challenging run, and looking back at what you just successfully conquered. When you're at the top of the hill, the only thing to do is take a deep breath, believe in yourself, and push off. Nothing makes anyone fall down faster than being overly cautious. Taking a leap of faith is not only about believing in yourself, but it also necessitates about being independent and standing your own ground. At the end of the day, you are the only person who can get yourself down that mountain. But the world always felt rather different when looking at it from that altitude. Perhaps it may have been the lack of oxygen up there, but I always felt rather refreshed, energized, and humbled from viewing the world up there. Brings me a sense of serenity. Val Thorens is the highest ski resort in Europe, lying above the tree line at an astounding 2,300 meters. We selected Val Thorens not only because of its height, but also because of its massive ski area, with over 600 kilometers of ski slopes. It is part of one of the largest ski areas in the world, Les Three Valleys, which is solely connected by hundreds of ski lifts and slopes. Val Thorens' scenery was by far the biggest standout for me. The milky white clouds floating in the howling wind matched the chalky white color of the snow scattered all over the colossal mountains. The forceful wind, blowing like a gale-like hurricane, providing us with the intrepid journey ahead. My first slope set a precedent for my whole trip. The crunch sound underfoot gave way to that sleek rasp of skis on snow, and I was on my way for all about 10 meters when I fell humiliatingly to the ground. All I remember was my mentor standing there, fighting off the urge to laugh while I sat there humiliated. Again to my feet, and again to the floor. And so the pattern continued, until finally, just once, I caught my balance, and I was on my way. In an instant, I was transformed into some Lord of the Alps. And from that moment, I was truly hooked. What I remember most is the feeling of electricity, of truly feeling alive in such a place devoid of life. You see pictures of such things, and it looks beautiful, but to stand there and take it in with your own senses is an entirely different thing. To feel the towering height above the world and seemingly infinite depth below simply cannot be communicated through the photo. To see a rainbow of colors in pure white snow, to feel utterly high on life while blasting down a mountainside, to be certain that is the closest thing to heaven on earth. It's all something that must be experienced to believe. Stepping out onto the glacier, 3,250 meters above sea level, I got my first full panorama view. It looked otherworldly. Time seemed to slow down, to freeze like the formations hugging the nearby cliffs below. I felt rejuvenated by nature, disconnected from the world beyond, but ever so in tune with the moment that I was in. Foremost, I'd like to thank my parents for allowing me the opportunity to go on this amazing trip, and my instructor Jean, who helped me prepare for and guided me through my practical experience. I would like to express my sincerest appreciation to Ms. Robenheimer for all the continuous support, patience, and motivation. Your guidance helped me in all my time of research and writings for this project. I could not have imagined a better mentor and advisor for this project. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome Zamo Silinda next. Please note that the following speech contains sensitive information that may be harmful to sensitive viewers. Thank you very much.
I'm not digging to be equal, but I'm fighting for it because I know I am equal. If I'm not doing that, then I'm asking you to elevate me when I don't need to be because I am enough. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zamoguhle Silinda, and for my Class 11 project, I decided to challenge myself by working on a very sensitive topic here in South Africa: gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is an act that results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm affecting women, girls, and femi-identifying people. Gender-based violence is a widespread problem that is impacting almost all aspects of life, and it is often said that gender-based violence knows no borders but South Africa. This continues with great strength without the necessary legal consequences for the perpetrators. I took this decision upon myself after the miserable death of the 19-year-old University of Cape Town student, Uyinene Mrekyan. I felt obliged to educate myself on this matter as a young South African woman, as this could happen to any one of us at any given time. For those of you who don't know what happened to Uyinene, Uyinene was tortured, raped, and murdered when simply going to the post office. When this blew our social medias, South Africa was mourning her death, and in my opinion, it was a very tragic time for this country. This tragedy sparked numerous movements and campaigns like #AmINext, #MeToo, and #EnoughIsEnough. Through this, a lot of women were able to voice their stories and have their voices heard. Going into this journey, I did not realize what I was getting myself into. I thought it will all be as easy as reading about gender-based violence and watching a few videos and then I'd be educated enough. It only hit me when I went to the Commissions of Gender Equality, or CGE, where I had the chance to observe and get a clearer view of what they do and believe in. Spending the day at CGE really opened my eyes about gender-based violence, and it was only then when it hit me that this was much bigger than me. I was not turned off by the idea that this seemed like a very difficult challenge that I could not handle, but I rather saw it as an opportunity to learn a lot more about gender-based violence and grow into the young woman I've become today. My intent for this project was to focus and look at where the transition took place regarding the journey to achieve gender equality in South Africa. And I believe it would be wrong of me to mark specific dates to state when oppression against women started, as this has been going on for centuries. As the world has evolved, women's roles have definitely shifted too. And in my opinion, and I think one would think, wow, with such an advanced growing society, we'd all be more accepting of all our people. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. Instead, violence has become a more accepted way to reaffirm and declare masculinity and dominance by men as the prominent perpetrators of these violent acts. During apartheid, women abuse was present, yet was not recognized because of the unfortunate circumstances that nothing would be done anyways, especially for women of color. Unfortunately, we are still living the same reality. When we start talking about stats, as my dear friend Leletu has mentioned, femicide in South Africa is 5 times higher than the global average, and 1 in 3 women in South Africa will be raped in their lifetime, meaning that 40% of South African women will be potentially raped in their lifetime. This statement bothers me so much because what exactly is being told to me as a young South African woman? You will be potentially raped in your lifetime. We're just letting you know. Because honestly, our government continues to fail us. So who do we rely on? What is being done about these stats? Yes, protests have been held to demand the government to take action. And we've heard the action. We're declaring a state of emergency. But I mean, really, we still yet to see change. Our women still live in fear, and we are tired. I feel that men of all races may have felt powerless when South Africa was declared a democratic state. And I quote, "Apartheid made violence an instrument of control, and so it became the norm in South Africa," said Alexa Matthews. When this stopped and everyone was equal, some men could not handle it, so they turned to women to show their capability of how powerful they still were. She carries on to say that violence against women represents a displacement of aggression in which men feel able to reassert their power. I feel that this is the perfect explanation, yet men still don't have a right to violate someone in order to show their dominance. I stand here in front of you, and women and girls are still exposed to gender-based violence, with it getting worse rather than better. My focus was not to look at gender-based violence theoretically. So to accomplish this, I focused more on getting an insight on the reality and a different perspective from other people. I accomplished this through having open discussions with people where we discussed issues like rape culture, role models, and consent. All these issues I felt perpetrated gender-based violence to its fullest, so I felt it was very important to focus on them. I also had the opportunity to interview victims of gender-based violence. It was very interesting to get the people's word and interact with different people, yet so challenging because I didn't know what to expect at any given point. It was also scary because majority of the victims I had interviewed are people that I know, which made me realize that this is much closer than we think it is. It is in our very own households. In total, I interviewed 13 people, but today I will only speak of 3 interviews that I conducted. To honor the identities of those interviewed, all the names have been changed. One thing I found interesting through my interviews is that I only had one male volunteer to have me interview him. This, to no surprise, sparked up the question to say, why do men shy away from having these conversations or don't want to have them at all? My first interview was with Jane Doe. Jane was raped between the ages of 4 and 5 by a man very close to her. She didn't know at the time what was happening to her until she was about 13 years old when she started having repressed memories. She made a choice to not report her rapist because, I quote, "This man supports a part of my family, and if he were to be prosecuted, a part of my family would collapse, which wouldn't be fair." This has impacted a lot of negative energy towards her life. However, she has evolved. She does not trust or look at men the same way women who have not gone through what she has gone through do. Once again, this takes us back to that it can be anyone and anywhere. Jane was a young, vulnerable girl whose dignity was taken away from her at the age of 4. I mean, what else needs to be done for perpetrators to realize that this is not okay? There is absolutely no way Jane or any other victim could be blamed. The rapist raped Jane when she was 4, and he is still living out there freely. Who knows who's next? I know that the more I listen to stories about gender-based violence, the more I cannot stop thinking about it. It made me paranoid because you can't predict life, and as women, we never know when it will happen. This is upsetting because we have to wait for a brutal death of one woman to be caught on camera, and that is when we'll start taking action. And even then, it is still women who are protesting. Following up on Jane's story, I had an interview with Tessa Green. What I found interesting from the interview I had was how she emphasized how we're always making excuses for these so-called animals. She said it's so unrealistic for us to even call them animals because honestly, no animal can be so cruel. Lastly, John. John stabbed his wife to death after he found out she was cheating on him. He also tried to kill himself after her death, but survived all incidents. He spoke to me about how he only realized after her death that he didn't love her, but rather he was obsessed with her, which is the main reason that led to her death. He opens up to me about being raped at a young age, and for him, that is what created his sex drive for women, and more importantly, being the only one in that woman's life and showing his dominance. He goes on and touches on the fact that he was so driven by sex just because that is the only time he felt more powerful. This was a nervous experience for me because I really had to think about everything I said, from the questions I asked him to what I felt I wanted to express and of what he had to say, because I wasn't sure if I was going to poke nerves that would put myself in danger or any other woman. But overall, as we went on, I started to feel a bit more comfortable, especially in what I felt I wanted to express. My journey with my project was something so great, as I challenged myself to the fullest, even through times I did not wish to. I know that my work started lacking when it came to me writing some of the information I had collected, because it felt as though I was reliving moments I did not wish to. This also made me think, how much more for women who have lived or are living through these experiences? One thing I also had to learn and accept is that I can never expect everyone I meet to think the same way I do towards gender-based violence. I cannot expect to go out and face the world and make the change just because I am broadcasting my change. What I'm trying to say here is change starts with you as an individual before anyone else, hence the name of my project, Be the Change. I'm not going to stand here today and pretend to know it all. I myself am still learning day by day. And one thing I still struggle with is calling people out. So I encourage everyone to hold the people we know accountable, because as you do that, you are bringing change, even if it is in the slightest move of action. As I end off my speech, I really want to challenge everyone to be vigilant of what you do or say in front of people, or when you're alone, because that then goes with your core beliefs and morals, because you never know what or whom you may trigger. Let us not forget our queens who have left us. Uyinene Mrojana, Tshegofatso Pule, Sinethemba Ndlovu, Renee Romans, Michaela Poison, Gwanele Zuma, Karabo Mukwena, Rieva Steenkamp, Kwasa Zozo, and all our angels who have fallen victim to gender-based violence. Lastly, I'd like to thank my parents for always being by my side and for your great support, even through days where my days weren't the brightest. Ms. Titus, my internal mentor, for your great advice and challenging me to the fullest throughout my project, because that has allowed me to grow into the young woman I have become today and see life in a whole different perspective. This is something I will forever be grateful for. My external mentor, Kekezo Mayema, for allowing me into your home with such warm hands and never hesitating to travel with me to your work events that worked to my benefit. Spending time with you and around you really made me feel that I could do anything in the world as a young Black woman. I'd also like to thank all the interviewees and everyone who contributed to making my project a success. I thank you, and thank you everyone for listening to my speech.
To such an extent that I didn't want to tell her things were wrong, whereas there are things that do not go right. I was so obsessed with her. You know, when I was in prison, I realized that it was not love, but it was an obsession. You know, I came out of prison in 2015. I'm a parole. I went, to see her grave. I just saw what I did, how bad it was. Silent, nobody around, in that faraway place. I was very young and I was raped by someone.
What age was this?
Oh, between ages of 4 and 5. Didn't understand at the time what was happening.
I am fighting, not because I feel I am worth more, not because I feel I am any less, but I am fighting because I know I am right. I refuse to live in fear. I refuse to become another statistic, not only for myself, but for all our mothers, our sisters, our aunts. I rise up, and no obstacle shall defeat my purpose, because I am enough.
Thank you, everyone. That's it.